Yeah, so my talk today is going to be about building web applications and all the things involved in doing so. So yeah, let's get started with, generally when you start building a web application, you want to make sure that you have some kind of component system because you want to share code between pages, right? So for example, you don't want to have 5 versions of the same button and 5 versions of your menu and that kind of thing. So generally you want to use React, right? Who here likes React? So yeah, and React is simple, right? Yeah. Because the most basic React component is just a function that returns some HTML or JSX. However, setting up React in terms of like all the things around it, it's very complex. Like getting ready for production and setting everything up, like compilation from like Webpack to Babel to code splitting to all these other things that are needed for your application to be very fast in production are very complicated and very hard to implement. In reality, it's gotten easier, but going to production is still complex. So generally, you need a framework for React that scales with your project, right? So, and furthermore, React is in a very interesting position because it's a very low-level library, so we can build a lot on top of it. And generally, when you start building a web application, you start off with static pages. You start building your marketing website, and it's fast and reliable. You deploy it to production. It's very fast. It all works. However, content changes require rebuilding, for example, which is one of the downsides. And as your project grows, pages are added, meaning that every time you, for example, you want to do something else than just a static page, you have to do something else. And so every page has different requirements, or can have different requirements. But your project is static, right? You started out with a static website, and the choice is very binary. So you choose either you go static or you don't go static. So how do you make your app scale with these changes? Because if you have multiple different pages that are in different situations, like, for example, you want to create a dynamic product page that is rendered on demand for every customer, you can't do that when you have a static site generator, for example. And furthermore, how do you make your app scale with size? So for example, this image shows how, for example, similar web app using Create React app, for example, you start out with just one bundle, and it grows, and the further it grows, it will increase the loading, the time to first byte, and the time to first contentful paint of your pages. Meaning that every time you add a page inside of your app.js, for example, is a burden on the rest of the application. So you have one giant big bundle that is app.js, and you have app.css, which is one giant CSS file. And this grows uncontrollably throughout the growth of your application. So this is where Next.js comes in, and Next.js helps you scale your application to multiple pages, many different views, and it allows you to focus on what's important, which is building fun things and making money. So you start by creating a pages directory, which is just a normal directory. And in pages, every path is mapped to, or every file is mapped to a route, meaning that if you create about.js, it will map to /about. And this is very similar to PHP, if you ever used that before. But generally, like, we've seen that many people gave us feedback, and this system is not perfect, right? For example, in your mind, you're probably thinking, if you have never used Next.js before, oh, how do I do, for example, product/ID? I want some dynamic parameters, right? So I'm very excited today to be sharing with you that we're currently implementing a proposal for doing dynamic routing inside of Next.js by default, by simply creating a folder, and inside of there a $ prefixed file that will be routed to these pages. And as you can see, it routes the /product/$ID to product/1, for example. But let's take a step back. What is a page? So a page is just a React component, which means that if you export any React component from a page, it will just work. It will be rendered. It will be you can interact with it, and it just works immediately. However, many pages can have many different rendering targets, meaning that you have to choose between rendering, for example, a server-side rendered application versus a static website versus a client-side rendered application. And it's often like this, where you're like, or basically the Google Chrome team created a slide that is all the different rendering targets possible for all kinds of applications. So that means that, for example, for full server-side rendering, you do, for example, you use a certain framework. Then for static server-side rendering, you use another framework. Then for server-side rendering with hydration, you use another framework. And you can see where I'm going with this. So every different rendering target has a different framework, and to use these different targets together, you have to use, for example, like 5 different frameworks, or 4, or 3, or 2. It depends on how much your application is dynamic, for example. So it often feels like this, which is basically you're looking at all these different options, and you're not sure what to choose, right? And if you choose one of these options, you can't change in the future. And today, I'd like to change that, at least for Next.js, which is that Next.js will be able to render to multiple targets at the same time in one application. So let's start with pre-rendering. So pre-rendering is a method to do static HTML build time, for example, using React. So you create a React component that's exported at build time. And it's great for like blogs and marketing pages, but you're rebuilding the application is required to update all these different static pages. So the way this works in Next.js is if you export something that isn't dynamic, it's automatically going to be static. You don't have to configure anything, it's just going to export it for you. So then there's server-side rendering, which Next.js is sort of known for, but we're sort of moving away to a more general purpose framework for all these different rendering targets. So in this case, you import get content to get content from your CMS, for example. And you use get initial props, which is a method that we invented to do data fetching. And it's included by default, and it fetches your data and then injects it into your React component. And generally, this is used for like headless CMS-powered websites and for frequently updated data. So like, for example, well, it's mostly like CMS and different data endpoints. And one more thing is that you can do client-side rendered applications, which means that if you create, for example, a dashboard, sometimes you don't want to use server-side rendering. We've got this feedback many times from many different people that they wanted to use Next.js, but they didn't want to use the server-side rendering part, for example. And starting today, you'll be able to do so by just adding in one function, which is, for example, useMounted, which works in a similar way to component.mount. And yeah, you can use it for dashboards and internal applications and classic single-page applications. But even going beyond React, because React is sometimes not all you want to render to. For example, you can have additional strategies that you'll have to employ for example, your employer wants to be indexed in the search results in Google as an AMP page, which is what Next.js also allows you to do. You can use AMP pages to build very fast web applications, and AMP pages are a standard, if you never heard of it. It's a standard that was started by Google, but now it's an open standard that allows you to build very fast web applications, but those are indexed by Google and used in their search results And they're highlighted by this lightning icon that you can see behind me, which is, if you click on that, it's going to load your page immediately, and it's loaded inside of Google. So we use this for example, Next.js.org, as you can see in the image. And it allows you to basically build. So the way we use it is we use it for our docs and for our blog, for example. And they're indexed, and they're showing this icon in Google, for example. And if you click on it, it will load the file inside of Google, and it's cached, and it's very fast. And what we saw, for example, in our use case, is that our engagement on Google, for example, went up by a tremendous amount. So yeah, there's two ways to render AMP inside of Next.js, which is you create a normal page, and then you opt into AMP hybrid, which is you have a React page for your users and an AMP page for search engines, and then for mobile web users. And this is the way to do like a hybrid app. So you have AMP plus your React app. However, there's also AMP first, which means that you build your whole page in AMP. And the interesting part here is that all strategies can be combined, meaning that you have one Next.js app that is like an about.js page, which is pre-rendered, statically exported, and it uses pre-rendering plus a hybrid AMP, for example. But then your dashboard is client-side rendered, and your product ID, which is a dynamically rendered route, has server-side rendering. So every page can be a different strategy, and this means that you can think of every page that you have as a different app, or like sort of like a micro front end even. And it's unified in a single framework, Next.js. So you use just one solution for all these different targets. And it allows you to build truly hybrid web applications. However, generally, you're not building just the front end, right? Except if you build your own personal website, for example, and some other use cases, you generally want something else too. For example, like a contact form. You can't build a contact form with just a static website. So you need a backend to handle your data, right? So to handle the forms, for example. And let's go over like how that generally works. So there's a lot here and a lot involved here, but let's start with we create a project, a separate project, right? Then we install our favorite web server, let's say Express or Koa or API or pretty much anything else. Then you create your endpoint and you boot up your web server and it all works, yes, happy us. And then we start making changes and we request the API again and we're like, oh, wait. It doesn't work. Then you spent like half an hour or something. I've done this like many times where I'm just like requesting the API and I forgot to restart my server, for example. So you need something an API server that scales with your project, basically. And running multiple servers. So say you built this separate server. You would end up building multiple separate servers because you're using microservices, for example. And you end up like running maybe 50 servers on 50 different ports. And you have to like manage the ports of those and all these other things. So it doesn't scale to more than a few endpoints, right? And I'm very excited that today I'm going to announce that we'll have support for API routes in Next.js by default. Meaning that if you used Next.js before, you might have used a custom server that requires you to set up a lot of other things to do API routes, for example, and you no longer need to do so. So the way this works is you start by creating an API directory, and this API directory has a contact.js file, which maps to /API/contact. And it has the same programmatic usage as an Express handler, meaning that the handle function has the same programmatic usage as Express, meaning that you can use res.json, for example. And one other thing, which is most people generally build an API which has like express middleware for cookies, for example, or different query strings, or like body parsing, that kind of thing. And that is all included out of the box, but you can opt out of it if needed to use another framework, for example. And the API routes are updated as you make changes. So I hope that this is going. It looks like it. Yeah, okay. So I don't see it on my screen, so I'll look like that. But so basically, you start by booting up Next, and then you request the URL, and it returns hello world, right? Then I end up opening pages API /hello.js, and I changed hello world to hello React Europe, right? There I sort of fail at closing Vim, as you all probably have done that before. And then I run curl again, and as you can see, like it has updated automatically. We didn't restart anything. The API was built on demand, meaning that we didn't compile it until you requested it, and it's all hot reloaded by default. But this doesn't end the story yet, which is, so you built your API endpoint, and it's handling some kind of data, right? So for example, you create a contact form, and your contact form is like really detrimental to your business because new customers are applying to be your customer, basically. So you can't afford it to break. So how do you avoid bugs? Anyone has an educated guess? Probably static type checking, right? So who here likes TypeScript? It's pretty much like half of the room, maybe more. So I'm very excited today. Like, has anyone set up TypeScript before? Because it's sort of like this hassle where you have to figure out all these things, which is, for example, how to set up your tsconfig, like how to do watching, how to like, for example, make the right things compile, for example. And I'm very excited today that we're announcing that TypeScript will be included by default in Next. So it's supported by default. The only thing that you have to do, and this is a very important point, you only have to change your page from pages/about.js to pages/about.tsx. Meaning that generally, like, you're now thinking like, but what about my tsconfig? Like, how is that going to work, right? So there's no need to set up your tsconfig because Next.js will automatically create the right tsconfig for building React applications if you don't have a tsconfig yet. So you're still fully in control of your tsconfig, but it just takes the hassle out of figuring out all these things to make TS work for Next.js and for React. And furthermore, it also fails Next build, the production build, when you have TypeScript errors. And also in development, we show warnings instead of like breaking things, because otherwise you end up like seeing these like TypeScript errors that are not really dependent on like if it works right now in development. So it shows those in a way that are just warnings, so it's not blocking you. And also the Next.js core is now written in TypeScript, meaning that every single API that you use from Next.js now gives you back types and type hinting, meaning that if you type something, it will automatically give you all the props and all these different like APIs that you have. For example, the router has different methods and that kind of thing. And those are always up to date because they're shipped with Next. Meaning that you no longer have to install, for example, @type/next, which was community maintained. We're now maintaining it ourselves inside of Next, and they're generated from our source code. So yeah, that's it about TypeScript. But say you have built your whole project and you fast forward into the future, what will happen? Your application grows to like hundreds of pages maybe, at least if you're like building a very large application. And every page that you add makes your production build slower. You've probably all experienced this. There was a talk yesterday about how Twitter had this problem where like the more they added, the slower things got. However, like, what is the cause of this? It's generally compilation. And how can you solve this? So there's some prior art here. And I still can't see it running, but this is a very quick slide, which is you run Yarn. You've used Yarn before, right? So you run Yarn like multiple times a day maybe. And if you run Yarn, it will actually check if there are files that need to be updated. And if there's no files to be updated, it just finishes in 33 milliseconds, which is very fast, right? So we wanted to do something similar for Next.js, but then for pages. Meaning avoiding rebuilding pages that don't have any changes. So Next.js will understand what your page is made up of, which is components. And if some component hasn't changed, or like if you have a page that has only components that didn't change, it will not recompile those components. And this is a really interesting thing because what happens is if you don't change, like, for example, you start building a blog and you start writing your blog posts and you have just one blog post and you're writing it and you're like pushing up the changes, for example. It will take maybe, like, say you have 100 pages, it will take maybe like 2-3 minutes before you can actually use and see the changes in production. However, with this new system, it actually reduces your build times to only a few seconds. So taking it from hours to milliseconds, basically. Hopefully you don't have hours because then there's something up in your application, but yeah, so Next.js scales with your project. And it goes from very small websites, which is, for example, my personal website on the left side, and Hulu, which is a very large streaming service in America and Canada and many other places, which is using Next.js for all of their pages on the right side. So it goes from a very small number of viewers, maybe none even, maybe now I'll have a lot of more viewers, but to like a streaming service that has millions of requests per month. But it's not just that. There's many other companies using Next.js in production currently, which is, it goes from like very small startups, like, or not even small startups, but startups like TicketSwap or Framer, for example, to Hulu and Twitch and all these, maybe you use these services daily, actually. If you use Hulu, for example, on the web, it will all be Next.js. And furthermore, we did a case study together with Hulu about how they scaled Next.js to their millions of users worldwide. And it goes into all these different cases where they wanted to scale their application from page to page, which this now solves. And if you want to learn more about Next.js, you can go to next.js.org/learn, which is an interactive tutorial that guides you through everything you need to get started with Next.js. Thank you very much.